Songwriter, a novel by Paul McCann, Chapter 5, The Emotions of a City. As I walked down Old Street, I noticed some of the empty buildings that had seen better days. I'm sure if these old foundations could have spewed up the tired old shells that stood crying out to the modern day architects for a reconstruction or a final demolition. A strange fascination crept over me as once again I happened to find myself in a place where I had never been before, and with absolutely no idea of how I got there or even why I was going this way or that. After walking through the rain for an hour or more, I knew I was lost. So I rang Linda again. In the end, I hailed a taxi cab. I was getting into a taxi, and a young lady threw herself in with me and said, "I hope you don't mind me sharing. I've been waiting for a bus for ages, and, well, a taxi fare halved is a burden shared." "Where are you going?" the driver asked. "Regent Street," the girl replied. "What about you?" I saw a number 43 bus on its way to Piccadilly and asked the driver where in London I was. "Near Covent Garden Square." "I beg your pardon?" "Near Covent Garden Square," he replied. "Oh, how on earth did I ever get from Old Street to here?" "Excuse me, sir, where do you want to go?" "Dalston," I said. "I hope you don't mind me jumping into your taxi." The girl seemed friendly. I looked at her and said, "Isn't it different looking at London through the window of a taxi? See those two people holding hands there? They must be in love. Hey, and look at those people hurrying to the underground." She smiled. Just as some of the neon lights came on around the city, the evening was cool and there was an electric in the air. There was a young, beautiful girl sitting next to me in the back of a taxi cab, and just as mystery was beckoning, the taxi pulled up and the driver reached out his hand for the fare. She handed over a few nuggets. The young girl thanked me and ran off down Regent Street. The taxi pulled away from the curb and made its way through the heavy traffic. As we passed Her Majesty's Theatre, I said, "Parting is such sweet sorrow. Take my advice and put her behind you. I've shared my cab with all kinds of girls. Some of them were nice and some rough. Usually the nice ones give me the most trouble." "Where in Dalston are you going then?" "Queensway Flats," I replied. "Oh, sure, I know them." A few moments' silence passed, and then he said, "I love London. Whereabouts in Belfast do you come from?" I had to laugh and said, "Would you believe me if I told you I came from Australia?" "Yes, I lived in Australia for a while," the driver said. We shared a brief story or two about different places we knew in Sydney, like Luna Park, some of the beaches. As much as I wanted to carry on talking, the driver pulled up outside the tower block where Linda lived. The driver reached out his hand and I paid him the fare and grabbed my belongings and said goodbye. Making my way inside the flats, I took the stairs because the lifts rarely ever worked. I stood outside her front door and prepared myself for what was ahead. I rapped with a confident knock, and when Linda opened the door, she put her arms around me and gave me a kiss. I liked the welcome, and it created an immediate reaction. I felt as if I had touched a personal place with her, which meant something to me. I walked into the flat and sat down. She sat next to me. Linda seemed reluctant to talk, so I started. "Good to see you again," I said. She almost broke down in tears. "I'm sorry for the way I spoke to you the last time you were here. It was because of Steve. He's very jealous, and I had to push you away." Slowly but surely I began to believe her. As the night went on, we drew closer to each other and even polished off a bottle of wine in the process. Something happened that night between Linda and myself. We shed tears. We cast off responsibilities for a little while. I could see that she was trapped in London and had nowhere else to turn to. She had a high-pressure job in marketing, and her latest nightmare was a debt. It seems Steve had been burning up a lot of Linda's money, mainly on drugs and gambling. He prevented her from doing things she wanted to do. The only reason he gave his KO for me to board was there was some extra money. And I looked at her and felt a pity. Steve owed over 3 weeks' rent to the council for the flat and was in red to the drug supplier. His job was on shaky grounds and his car was in need of repair. Linda had asked if I could pay the 3 weeks' rent in advance, and I said I would, but that I needed to get to my bank and get some of the money out. I realised there and then that it was not me that Linda was interested in, but it was my money, and I almost felt something kick me in the guts. The walls began to close in on me, and there was many memories of me in this flat already. Too many moments and too much hurt. I decided that I would stay the night, but the first thing I would do in the morning would be to move out and chance my arm, sleeping rough until I could find a job that would pay my fare across the water to my hometown in Belfast. I had to let Linda sort out her own life and try to forget about someone that I didn't care about very much. I had to leave behind the girl that I had met in Coffs Harbour and the admiration I once had. In my heart there was nothing left for Linda but pity. Morning tapped me on the head as if I was a baby in the arms of his mother. I got up and I had a shower. Linda had made breakfast for both of us, and then she put on her coat and walked out the door. "I'll see you later then, Linda." "I'll see you later." "Have a good day," I replied. From her balcony, 13 floors up, I watched Linda catch the bus for work. For a while, I felt removed from everything. I watched the traffic below race along the road, avoiding the odd pedestrian that suddenly scurried across the roadway. As time went on, sidewalks were alive with people. The presence of space invaded my mind, and I started to think about so many things we often take for granted in life. I thought about the sun that rises in the morning. I felt my thoughts chase some of the everyday things around us. Those busy hums in the house, like water running from the tap, a wall with a picture, a book on a table, good company. The sound of rain hitting a roof as you drift off to sleep can be music to the ears. The security of lying on a comfortable bed, thinking of the day that has been, of the things that we have seen. That can be decadence. Then I thought, how lucky are those who take all of this for granted and do not have to suffer the songwriter syndrome. Being a songwriter can separate you from the world, and as you become more in tune with the subconscious, you notice a world where many things are taken for granted. So many times I thought about having a wife and a home and children all gathered round at the dinner table. I wish for things at times like electric lights, baths, soft sofas, good food and shelter from the cold streets that so many times home is and has been for me. London so far had been merciless and hard, and I stood there on the balcony and thought for a while. And for a while I thought about things, the cold world outside that awaited my presence. A sudden adrenaline surged through my thoughts on an elevator, and deep down I felt like life inside of me stirring into a new awakening. I grabbed my bag, my guitar, and in that instant I walked out the door of the flat, leaving nothing but a shadow behind me. As I walked into the lift, Linda's next door neighbour got in. as well. She had a nice face, kind, pleasant to look at. As I smiled at her, she spoke. "Are you a friend of hers?" "Not really," I replied. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Oh, I don't know," I replied. "Jesus can save you," she said. I know, but I'm already saved," I said. She burst out with laughter and almost sang her response. "Praise the Lord, child. My name's Maria. What are you doing later on this evening?" "Nothing, Maria. My name's Paul." We got out of the lift on the ground floor and she said, "Do you want to come along for some praise and worship with me and my husband later on, Paul?" "Oh, sure. Be here at 5:30 and we will take you with us." "Okay, Maria. See you later then. Bye. Have a good day." Oh yeah, at last I met someone who was genuine, a real article. I could see some light in the tunnel. For most of the day I wandered round checking out the sights, with thoughts of finding a corner somewhere where I could go busking. I was drowning in a sea of angry faces and quickly gave up the idea of busking in London. Being a stranger in London is very hard for some to accept. I stood out like a sore thumb on a pavement. I was called a lot of different names. The blacks called me Hunky and the whites called me Paddy. There was no place to escape to. I walked along a lonely path and found the front door of a pub not far from Dalston police station. You know how when sometimes things go wrong, which triggers a series of events that seem to snowball? Well, that's just what started to happen to me. Murphy's Law was running out of control and nothing stood in its way. I threw down a pint and went to answer nature's call. I suddenly, innocently, stumbled into the ladies instead of the gents, and within seconds I was thrown up against the wall by this gorilla, who also ran the bar. I tried to explain to him that I didn't know this pub. It was my first time in there. But he was just too mad and too bad to convince. A short scuffle developed with me coming off the worst. There was a difference of opinions, and when I told this gorilla that I'd never walk through the door of his pub again, he never blinked an eye. When I asked him if he treated all his customers like this, he called me a pervert. His eyes began to burn and his forehead began to sweat. It was time for me to go. So I pushed him away from me, and although shaken up a little, I did manage to walk unassisted from the pub. I'm sure there were skid marks left behind me. My nerves were jumping and my heart was thumping. I walked on almost along the Kingsland Road, trying to avoid hard faces that was passing me by. Sure enough, this part of the city was giving me a real welcome. I got on the first bus that came along the Kingsland Road and spent an hour getting over what just happened. I got off at Liverpool Street Station and just wandered into a train. I got off the train and had no idea where I was. For some reason, I guessed that I was somewhere near West Ham. I walked along strange sidewalks and made my way to a place I had never seen before in my life. Feeling very lost, I thought things couldn't get much worse. So I stood in the doorway of a pawnbroker shop and watched people pass by. I saw a black taxi and put my hand up. I left my troubles in the doorway and jumped in the taxi. It was a second gear for me, not really travelling in full motion yet. Part of the morning was still left. I asked the taxi driver to drop me near Trafalgar Square. He left me at Charing Cross Road, where people sat at tables at a cafe in the morning sun drinking tea and coffee. I took up a position in Trafalgar Square and started busking some of my songs. I played for about an hour and felt empty and left empty-handed. I thought to myself, at least the pigeons seemed to enjoy the music. I promised myself to return again every day for a week until I received some kind of reward for my trouble. I was on the air now as lunchtime crowds started to arrive, pushing themselves along sidewalks not far from the South Bank Centre. A tiny piece of green grass became the resting place for a great number of people who had found a place to capture refreshment and a brief escape from their busy day. I sat nearby and played some easy blues to the midday sun. Nobody told me to move on or shut up, so I stayed and continued to play some of my songs. I pulled out my blues harp and placed it in my mouth. I was grateful for the small change in my pocket because it was all that I had left. I made my way to St. Paul's and withdrew £20 from the electronic cash machine at the National Westminster Bank. I went into a cafe called the Rising Sun and I ordered bacon and eggs for a late lunch. By the time I finished eating, it was time to make tracks for Dalston and keep my appointment with Maria. I needed some extra money, so I went back to the bank to make another withdrawal, but I was left feeling angry after the electronic cash machine swallowed my card. The bank was closed and I was left at a loss. Being Friday didn't help either, as I was faced with a weekend with no money. I was almost going to ring Linda at her flat, but thought I better not. With only £10 of ready cash left on me, I decided to walk back to Dalston. I really had no idea where I was, so I began to walk along Fleet Street. It was rush hour and I got caught up in a head-on battle with the pavement people. I was amazed how many people actually tried to knock you off your feet. It was a big effort to remain upright. A car pulled up beside me, and to my surprise, it was Maria. In the passenger seat. "Hi Paul, get in." I got into the back seat and within minutes we were far away from the stampede. Maria introduced me to her husband driving the car and I was invited back to their flat for some dinner. The kindness offered to me by Maria and her family was in a nutshell Christianity in action. After dinner we all left the flat and went to church. We arrived in good time at the Bible Way Church in 3 Threes Lane in Bethnal Green. The church was part of the Good Shepherd mission. The silent echoes inside the church building began to disappear as the community began to fill the seats in the church. A small music ministry took up one corner and they needed no books, no amplification. Their only instruments were tambourines and a very old keyboard. But what they did have was soul. The sound was alive and full. I had never before heard such worship. And as the entire congregation joined in, well, what praise was offered up. Over the years I had been involved with charismatic renewal in the Catholic Church as well as the conservative hymnal praise. I had been part of youth groups in Sydney with the Catholic Church where praise and worship were free forms of expression with God. I had been with church choirs that could sing, but man, these West Indian brothers and sisters from Bethnal Green, well, they could really swing. For the introduction to the service, we lifted up our hands high above our heads, and our voices were many, but the praise was like one voice. We shook the rafters and rattled the floorboards. We danced and we sang. What a joy it was. The good minister, Reverend Harry McFarlane, spoke when the time was right, and we all listened to the word. It was electric, and everyone was charged with God's message. I stood and looked around at the sea of faces, and I noticed for the first time that I was one of two who had white skin. It also dawned on me that I was probably the only Catholic in the building. It was encouraging to find no barrier was present, and a genuine smile welcomed me into the community. Reverend Harry spoke of the rich person who gave a small portion of his wealth to the church, in contrast to a very poor person who gave a penny. But that penny was all the wealth that person possessed. At this moment, a collection plate was passed around. I put a £10 note on the plate, and that was everything I had. Somehow I knew I would find an answer to prayer. The service ended, and Reverend Harry came over to me. He shook my hand, and I went on to tell him a few things about myself. When people can help and God can intervene, a door opens. Harry heard what I had to say, and he knew I had no place to stay and no money. And he asked some of the people in the church community for help. The church was almost empty, and only a handful of people were left. I was approached by Reverend Harry, who introduced me to Doris Telford. What a big heart! As big as Bethnal Green, Doris offered me her family home until I was ready to leave. That evening, I sat with her and her 2 teenage children in the comfort of her family home, which was a small council flat near Hackney. The comfort of a family home. Doris was a middle-aged lady, and she stood 5 feet tall. Her face glowed with kindness, and her eyes showed a great depth of character. The first week with the Telfords was like heaven on earth. There was always a pot on the stove with red kidney beans, rice and broth. I never met Mr. Telford, and nobody ever spoke of him, so I never bothered asking too many questions. One morning, Doris asked me if I could do a few little jobs for her and her daughter, Patricia, who I was brought around to meet that very same day. Doris had some groceries to buy, and so she left me with Patricia, who went in, and she lay down in her bed, and she called me and asked me to sit down beside her. I did as she asked, and then I listened to her as she started to ramble on about the most far-fetched things. I was lost in a one-way conversation that meant nothing at all to me at all. Eventually she stopped talking and pointed to the ceiling and walls. "Oh, could you paint this red and yellow? I want to show you something," she said. She reached under the bed and pulled a large tubular container that encased a huge wallpaper mural of a sunset on some exotic island. "I want this poster on that wall," she said. "No problem. So, have you got any wallpaper paste?" I asked. "What?" She seemed a little unsure about what I said. I explained to her that in order to get her mural on the wall that I would need to have some wallpaper paste to paste it on the wall. "Oh, how much does the paste cost?" she asked. Well, it's not just the paste. You'll also need some turps to wash out the paintbrushes." She asked me to pass over her handbag from the dresser, and from her purse she handed me £20. And she said, "Is that enough to cover the cost for your materials?" I nodded that it would be. Would you mind? I'll be leaving soon." "Oh, will you mind leaving the room, please? I need to get dressed." She slowly pushed the blankets off her and sat up. Before I even got to the landing of the staircase, she came out from the bedroom and asked me to take a look at her bathroom wall. "I want this tiled. Is it a hard job to do?" Not too hard. Have you got the materials?" I asked, almost knowing that she hadn't. From underneath a wooden box that she used as a step to get into the bath, Patricia produced a small box of white tiles. "Here you go," she said. Where's the grout and cement?" I asked. Her face went bright red. "You mean I'm going to need other products to put these tiles on the wall?" Yeah, of course you do," I replied. "Well, in that case, I guess I'll have to use up that £20 I gave you." She sounded anxious. She sounded even a little angry. I looked at the £20 more than once. She went away very quiet and then uttered, "Is £20 enough?" "I don't really think so," came my reply. "Well, try and stretch it out, huh? I don't get paid this week." "Oh, I have to go to work now, so can you come back this evening and get started on the job?" I nodded with a slight sigh. Well, I suppose I'll have to buy the things I need to get the job done. Patricia showed me the door and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry to push you out, but I'm late for work, so see you later then, okay?" From the other side of a closing door, I replied, "Yeah, sure, see you later." I walked around Hackney for a while, looking for a paint and paper store. I had to be careful with the tight budget I had to get the job done. I knew it was going to be difficult, but thought if I bought the smallest quantities I could, maybe I would just be able to scrape it in. After shopping around, I finally had purchased what I needed to get the job done. I went to Doris's place, but nobody was home. So I went back to Patricia's and sat outside her door waiting for her to come home. I had fallen asleep by the time Patricia got home. She shook me. Patricia had 2 children hanging from each arm, and she introduced me to them as they both smiled at me without fear. They were no more than 5 years old. I followed them into the flat and went straight to work. I painted the ceiling white, and around the various carvings of flowers on the ceiling, I spent time and hand-painted each flower a different colour. I had been so busy painting that Patricia had not said good night. I might have kept painting the ceiling until the morning, but as the flat grew quiet and the sound of snoring came from the children's bedroom, I made up the wallpaper paste and started to unroll the paper mural from the sunset tube. I came in 3 sections. So I started the middle section first, and by the time the picture was up, Patricia and her family were getting out of bed in the morning. As she came into the room, I stood back and smiled at the night's work that I had done. Patricia walked around like a chief inspector, pointing here and there, murmuring this and that. Finally she spoke. "I don't like it." What?" I replied. She had a vicious look on her face and almost spat as she spoke. "Look at my beautiful sunset. It's hanging off the wall." I had to stretch out the paste as it had to go a long way. This really made me see red. The paste and paper were still drying, and if she had given me more money to get the job done in the first place, I would have no loose ends here or there. The more I stood, the worse it got. She launched into another verbal assault on my work. "Oh, this is horrible. I'm really very upset about the bedroom, how it looks, so I can't live here any longer. I have to have some breakfast and get ready for work." I hadn't slept all night, and at this point in time I was ready to explode with rage. I was very hurt by Patricia's attitude, and her criticism of my efforts left me deflated and distracted. Instead of having it out with her in the presence of her 2 kids, I left her flat and returned back to Doris's place. Doris could see I was upset when I arrived. After I told her what had happened at her daughter's, she nodded as if this kind of thing was a regular occurrence. Not only had Doris understood and believed everything I had told her, but she turned and handed me £10 straight from her purse. She told me not to worry and to get some sleep. I slept most of the day and was awoke for dinner by Doris. I felt at ease and knew I was welcome at their dinner table. With the wanderlust itch at my feet and my cash flow slowly but surely eroding away, I needed space to write things racing through my head. It was difficult to find inspiration at Doris's, so I needed an escape hatch. Most mornings it was very early for me rising to make it down to Hackney, where I would stand in a long job queue, hoping for a day's work outside the Department of Social Services, because each morning employers would ring up the department before 7 o'clock, and each morning casual work was there, and as the jobs went, it was first come, first served, so you had to be first in the queue. I was lucky to have secured some work in a small clothing warehouse in Dalston Lane, where I packed and priced various garments for retail stores. When the position there closed, I found myself walking the streets of London in the hope of finding some steady work. Exhausted by my efforts to find employment, I eventually stumbled into the Department of Health and Social Security one cold October morning. In a desperate attempt to receive some financial assistance from the government, I explained my situation to the department officer at the front reception. He looked at me with a pity on his face and seemed to indicate I was not eligible for any assistance. I persevered until he gave in and told me to take a seat. That moment, at a window further along, a very angry young lad began to scream and hurl abuse at the civil servant who worked for the Department of Social Services. I made my way past him, just as he started to throw punches at the window. Maybe it was the way I looked at him, I don't know, but he turned in anger on me. I continued to walk past him, and he slurred out, "Oh, that's it, old man, just mind your own business, huh?" Like a ton of bricks, I thought, am I really an old man? No one had ever called me that before. I was a little shocked by this comment and wondered if all the knocking about I had during the past few years was taking its toll on me. Deep in a rut of reality, I surrendered to the vacant plastic chair. Around me, I found a crowd of people waiting. There were 6 rows of green plastic chairs filled with people who looked just like I did, very tired and beyond frustration. We all sat there. An hour, then another passed. No one spoke. A fellow in my row with a definite weather-beaten look decided to move on. Then at last there was some action. The lady at the reception called the names of at least half of the people in the room. These people seemed to be issued with some kind of payment. The fellow with the weather-beaten look who had previously left returned to his seat. He held a cup of coffee and a hot chip. Now, I can't say if he had heard my stomach that grumbled and rumbled with hunger, but when he offered me a share of his chips, I thank God in heaven for his kindness. He spoke to me in a thick Scottish accent, and I was educated by a man who had obviously lived rough in London for many years. He told me of every one of his 6 different names and addresses, and how he managed to receive 6 different gyro checks every week. He also told me where I could find some food and shelter if I needed to find it. I had spent all day waiting in the Social Security office without anything to show for it all at the end of the day. However, I did have a short list of places where I could find emergency accommodation thanks to my friend, the Scottish traveller. As the days went on, I felt I had worn out my welcome with Doris and her family, and even though she would have continued to provide accommodation for me in her flat, I decided it was time for me to move on. It was really nice to have had some time to praise and worship with Doris and the community at the Bible-Way Church, but for God's grace there I had to be, leaving them, and with the hope in my heart I moved into my new surroundings at St. Paul's International Youth Hostel. I slept in the bottom bunk in dormitory 66. All the inmates, if you would like, were all from different places in the world. After a long day busking in central London, it was refreshing to speak with some of the friendly Australians and Canadians at the Carter's Lane Youth Hostel. I was refreshed by the company of kind people and almost felt human again, to the point where I hoped a laugh might squeeze out and surprise my broken heart. I sat with the other travellers and listened to their wonderful stories and wished I could make some up for to tell them. But instead we played chess and shared our moments in silence. I watched as my pawns fell victim to the Queen and Bishop. I had to strike back with my castle. It was at this point when the game took on a new meaning. I was lost as the challenger spoke chess talk. I took his meaning as a clever strategy and told myself not to be distracted. I found the American travellers very genuine and generous with their time, and although faces changed almost every day, there were the few people like myself who remained. The world was spinning fast, and I really didn't realise it until the day that everything stopped, suddenly. Because one day after I returned from busking, to my shock, I found all of my belongings had been taken from underneath my bed. All I had was gone. Money, clothes, personal documents, passport. In fact, all I had was gone, except for what I stood up in, and my guitar. Completely shattered, and as alone as I ever felt in my entire life, I wondered how I would ever get out of this situation. I asked myself the question, is there anything good I can take from this? Then it came to me that God had been taking care of my work. With a sigh of relief, I was glad that I had left all my songs in a bag at the Good Shepherd Mission. Maybe it was then I realised that a blessing was on its way into my life and working in a way that I would never know. It wasn't the first time, may I add, that my songs and literary works were protected from harm. So I knew that there was something special about what I was doing. I tried to imagine that everything that goes wrong is for a reason. I tried to think the purpose that I was doing something right, and hoped that somehow all of that would right the wrongs with my songs. I dreamt that one day I would be famous and that my songs would be popular. I made my way to Bishopsgate and reported the theft to the police. There was nothing they could do except make the report and file it away. I asked them if they could contact my bank in Australia and inform them about my situation. But they answered me, "Why don't you tell your bank in London?" "Oh, I don't have a bank in London," I told them. "Sorry, it's a tough world out there," came the reply. I walked from the police station in the snow with no money and no place to go. But I had burned those bridges behind me. When the Salvation Army at Blackfriars found me, I was in a bad way. I had been sleeping rough and was in need of food and rest. After some weeks I had picked up and was walking around again on my feet. I was informed by the captain of the Salvation Army that a friend of mine in Australia by the name of Joe had contacted people in Australia and informed them that I had gone missing. For many people, they would have written off my disappearance in London as another regular event, but no, I had angels on my side. During the time I had left Australia, I had been sending postcards and correspondence from all of the places where I had been. And when my good friend Joe had not received a word from me for a while, he did a very noble thing and informed officers of the Salvation Army in Granville back in Sydney that I had gone missing. Then in turn, the Salvation Army people in Granville chased up their people in London who went on a search for me. It really is a miracle that they found me, but they did. Because I was without money and clothes, and the Salvation Army helped me obtain income support from the Department of Health and Social Security. At last now there was money to pay for my keep at the Blackfriars shelter, and I attended their prayer time each morning. There were the salvos, and a new way of praising God, and new places to visit during the day in London. First I found myself walking to the gates of Buckingham Palace. I tried to ask the guards if I could get in and talk to the Queen, but they never answered me. I asked how could I get a job in the palace, but they refused to speak. Eventually they told me to move on. After a while I discovered Hyde Park and the Heckler's Corner, so I began to speak my mind to the people of the way. After all, there were more than a few who had nothing to lose before they could find it, and I was one of those kind of people. Now, the way I found was like a narrow path of life where faith is the only companion that you have. And my way became a way of faith and a walk in faith every day of my life. I was known as the poet, prince and pauper of Piccadilly. Met and spoke with African kings and made friends in the wild West End. There are so many things buzzing on the West End every second of the day. London has many doors, and behind those doors are people in shells like prisoners of fate awaiting release. There are so many things that lie just outside the door, from drugs to drink, from poverty to hunger, from greed to comfort. Where the hopeless lie begging for food, good men and women stand with their hands outstretched. Where the rich go eating and filling themselves, so does their shame on the Thames that turns every day greener and deeper until the satisfaction of its hunger is consumed by its shame. When you are in the lion's mouth, you can always find a compassionate heart. On the other side of the coin, you'll find the breath of the lion's roar, from Lambeth to the Tower Bridge door. It's as cold and without pity on the merciless street. London is a big city, and it takes a brave man to try and tame the lion on its streets. Everyone is looking for something and somebody. I was looking for a break with my work. I sang all day without pay to the passers-by. Abuse and scorn from morn to night taught you to fight even harder to make it work out right. I wandered through Waterloo like a man on a mission, with inspiration flowing in a storm of new songs and new writings that had returned with a vengeance. All I needed was a place to sit and write down on paper how I felt. I found that around London there were lots of empty houses and flats. These were run-down empty buildings, and although some of these provided a perfect place to write, I wished for something a little more cleaner, and so I went walking from street to street every day. Not too far away from the south bank of the Thames, I came across places of intrigue. My feet took me to the inner secrets of sidewalks and life where I spent hours every day. In the poetic library at the top of the festival hall, that was my sanctuary, my escape hatch from the world. I sat there almost every day inside the poetry library and became very prolific with my literary works during this time. Now I really had a place where I felt at home. With my collection of songs now growing, I realized how much suffering is part of anything at all worthwhile mentioning in life. For the salt it's worth suffering for. I thought about the Tin Pan Alley days and took some strength from that and started walking into publishers, cold canvassing off the street. I even went into a stockbroker's in Sun Street and asked if they could support me financially with my songs. I was so surprised when I was brought into the manager's large office for a long discussion. He almost came to the party, but when he asked for my contact details, I was unable to give him any because of my current homeless situation. Some days I walked into pubs, and if there was a piano there, I would sit down and start to play some of my songs. Sometimes it worked out and the crowd enjoyed it. Other times the patrons were too drunk even to notice. Now and then I was sending some thoughts out. At the same thought, I was sent packing by the publican. Shared my gift every chance I could with everyone that I met and every chance that I had. All of my songs were living moments. They were personal and powerful. I wanted them to be heard. I needed them to be appreciated. London is a hard place to be when you're alone and trying to get a break. I continued to busk and make music every day. But as far as getting that break, nothing was really happening. End of chapter 5.